Dear friends, you are business executives. Business interacts with geopolitics. It is one of the weaknesses of business schools not to emphasize enough the interplay between these two realities. In the ESG era, it is highly problematic. The war that erupted on February 24th illustrates the connection between economy and international politics. For Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, the world's largest asset management firm managing $10 trillion, the conflict in Ukraine puts an end to globalization as it unfolded in recent decades. There is some truth in his assessment when one considers that the COVID pandemic had already altered the dynamics of globalization as we knew it since the 80s. Due to Ukraine's size, to its geographic position, because directly or indirectly, this war impacts the entire world, the moment is grave. For Russia, Ukraine is not perceived as just another country. Think about Vladimir I, Grand Priest of Kiev in the 10th century, what he represents for the development of Russian culture and the Russian Orthodox Church. I am asking you to remember that Russian President Vladimir Putin is a deeply religious person. Watch carefully. It is on the internet, the solemn ceremony during which he was blessed by Patriarch Kirill after becoming president of Russia. When in 2008, Ukraine looked towards NATO and NATO towards Ukraine, President Putin signaled his firm opposition by sending troops in Georgia. In 2014, causes of identical nature produced the same effects. Russia took Crimea back and a conflict ensued in the Donbass region. For 8 years, the parties, Ukraine, Russia, the OSCE, France and Germany, were unable to have the Minsk Agreement implemented. After becoming the new president of Ukraine in May 2019, Volodymyr Zelensky did not reassure Moscow. For the Kremlin, Kiev was being instrumentalized by a US-led West obsessed by Russian re-emerging power decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 1962, consistent with the Monroe Doctrine, the US did not accept Soviet missiles in Cuba. It could have been able to empathize with Russia's sensitivity in relation with its near abroad. I have just mentioned some of the deeper causes that generated the conflict. Analysts speculate on the more immediate causes in the year preceding the war. The fact is that Mr. Putin decided to send his army in Ukraine on February the 24th, after recognizing the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics in the Donbass region on February 21st. His decision to use a considerable military force, 119,000 Russian troops are believed to be in Ukraine at the moment, almost 1/5 of Russian active military personnel, was made under the assumption that it would be, for Russia, a quick victory. It was, in fact, a tragic miscalculation. After 22 years in the Kremlin and 2 years living in a COVID bubble, was Mr. Putin capable of listening to dissonant recommendations coming from his most honest advisors? The way he publicly humiliated his chief of foreign intelligence service, Sergei Narishkin, answers this question. Sun Tzu in Art of War presents a thought that should always guide the strategist. I quote, 知己知彼，百战百胜, unquote. That can be translated as, if you know yourself and know your enemy, you will not be imperiled in 100 battles. Mr. Putin underestimated the capacity of Ukraine to resist under the leadership of President Zelensky, EU's cohesiveness, and NATO's resolve. Meanwhile, he overestimated the combat readiness of his army. Strategists can also reflect upon the words pronounced by Kutuzov in Tolstoy's masterpiece War and Peace. Patience and time are my warrior heroes. The significance of China's position on this issue is proportionate with its geopolitical weight. Obviously, China has never been pushing for the extension of NATO. It has to be clearly reaffirmed that China has no responsibility, direct or indirect, in the personal decision of Vladimir Putin. The idea that President Xi Jinping knew about Mr. Putin's intentions and therefore could have influenced them is simply delusive. In the aftermath of the tragedy, the US and the EU asked China to join their policy of punishing and isolating Russia. China's reaction is well summarized by a Chinese saying, tie ling hai xu xi ling ren, or in English, the person who removes the bell from the tiger's neck must be the person who fastened the bell. In other words, the one who creates a problem should be the one to solve it. Facing the new reality created by Vladimir Putin's decision, did China express support? No, it did not. By referring to the necessity to respect territorial integrity, China refused to endorse Russian military action in Ukraine, which is a sovereign and independent country since 1991. China is simply defending its own interests. While it is developing highly productive relations with the West, it cannot antagonize its gigantic neighbor in the North. In 2021, China-EU trade amounted to $828 billion, China-US trade to $755 billion, and China-Russia economic exchanges to $147 billion. Expect China to recalibrate its relations with Russia, but China will not sanction Russia. It should not come as a surprise that China follows her own path in an independent manner with an eye on the big picture and the long term. Whether on Iran, North Korea, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, China rightly anticipates the indispensable role of Russia, one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. The key question is, how do we get out of this tragedy? A long crisis brings more pain for everyone, and it increases the risks of extension and escalation of the conflict. The political goal should be Ukraine's neutrality. Ukraine's authorities should commit to stay out of NATO. NATO should guarantee that it will not enlarge to Ukraine, while Russia should respect Kiev's sovereignty. Synergies between the US, the EU, Russia, China, and Ukraine are obviously a prerequisite to such a comprehensive security arrangement. The Secretary General of the United Nations should take the necessary measures to facilitate such an agreement and its implementation. The economic reconstruction of Ukraine is also essential. Before the war, Ukraine's GDP per capita, $4,380, was already the lowest on the European continent. International financial institutions, the US, the EU, and China should coordinate their efforts. After the general agreement on security is reached, Russia should be associated to the economic reconstruction of the region. Following the First World War, John Maynard Keynes, in Economic Consequences of Peace, explained the necessity to be inclusive in planning post-war development. European leaders are responsible for peace and prosperity in Europe. February 24th is primarily their collective failure. Europe has to wake up. It failed the first time to build what Mikhail Gorbachev called the Common European Home, a system that would have included Russia for peace and prosperity from the Atlantic to the Ural Mountains. Neither the US nor China has to shape 21st century Europe. It is in the hands of the Europeans. At the global level, progress and peace will depend on the nature of the relationship between China and the US. In China and the World, a book that I have edited, the underlying idea is that despite all the difficulties, synergies between China and the West are already a reality, and they have the potential to be taken to another level. The truth is the whole, affirmed Hegel in the preface of the Phenomenology of Mind. Do not choose one of the three major theories of international relations that I am going to mention. Each of them has some relevance. Samuel Huntington was right to highlight the cultural factor in geopolitics. In that sense, one should not expect the relations between China and the West to be anything else than complex. John Mearsheimer has certainly enriched the debate on international relations with the notion of offensive realism. For this realist point of view, a superpower is always looking for more power. Offensive realism explains NATO's tendency to extend as well as Russia's attempt to increase its influence. Having recognized the realist factor, one has also to acknowledge the advancement of international law, and as such the relevance of the liberal internationalist approach of geopolitics. The UN International Court of Justice has ordered Russia to immediately suspend its military operations in Ukraine. It makes the illegality of Russia's actions unquestionable. Besides, any war crime that may have been committed in Ukraine should trigger the most rigorous and transparent legal process in the framework of the International Criminal Court. The US, that never ratified the treaty establishing the ICC, has to rethink its relations with this international tribunal. The early intuition of Francis Fukuyama should not be completely dismissed. He himself radically criticized this book, The End of History and the Last Man. But it would be superficial to write off the insights of Alexandre Kojève, Russian-born French philosopher whose powerful reading of Hegel had such an impact on Europe in general and on Francis Fukuyama's reflections in particular. Globalization's modalities are evolving, but the concept of universality it presupposes, and the awareness that mankind is the culminating horizon are well alive. History has not ended, but the concept of its final incarnation might well have manifested itself. The European Union, the United Nations have yet to be perfected, that is, history goes on, but they constitute a progress compared with the status quo ante. They contain in them the concept of a better governance and of a cooperative mankind. In what China calls a community of shared future for mankind, allow me to see an echo of this idea. Should there be indeed a correspondence, it would reinforce my belief in progressive evolution. I thank you for your attention.